black and wearing a military cap. You've got some nerve, Officer Doyle sneered as he forced the elderly man's bike to a stop in the middle of the intersection. Without reading him his rights or stating any violation, he and his partner Roy tore through the old man's backpack, ripped apart his veteran ID, and laughed when he didn't fight back. But they had no idea the man they were humiliating had once saved dozens of soldiers in Fallujah, and just 6 minutes later, the ground trembled as a convoy of military vehicles rolled in. What ending awaits those who think a uniform gives them the right to belittle others? Watch until the end to find out. Elijah Freeman, nearly 70, rode his motorcycle through the afternoon haze like a ghost passing through a city that no longer owed him anything. The wind tugged at the loose edge of his cap, faded almost beyond recognition, once a proud U.S. Navy, now reduced to a single, stubborn letter, N. That cap had seen salt air, oil smoke, and blood. Now it sat atop a weathered scalp, as if still standing guard. His bike sputtered beneath him, exhaust rattling, the torn vinyl seat haphazardly stitched with dental floss, throttle wrapped in silver duct tape as if willpower alone held the thing together. But he didn't look broken. He looked forward, back straight, chin level, posture carried not by pride but by memory. As he approached the red light at an intersection, flanked by concrete and silence, he slowed to a crawl. The stop wasn't abrupt, just measured, like a man who'd learned long ago how to conserve momentum for the long war ahead. He didn't rest his back, he didn't slump, he remained upright, as if the stoplight itself required permission to command him. One gloved hand reached to retie the fraying parachute cord knotted around his wrist. A ritual, not superstition, not comfort, just a habit built under gunfire. A gust swept through the intersection. The air was dry, cruel. The corner of his cap flipped up, almost in rebellion, and he caught it between two calloused fingers without looking, gently pressing it down like putting to rest a memory no one else had earned the right to know. Then a slow movement in the periphery, a black and white patrol car, quiet as a shadow, crept into the crosswalk from the adjacent lane and parked itself directly in front of him. Not at an angle of curiosity, at an angle of ownership, like he had no right to the road, or to the hour, or to the space he occupied. The cruiser idled with a low growl, tinted windows like judgmental eyelids. Then, the passenger side door opened, not with urgency but with ceremony. The officer who stepped out didn't greet, didn't ask, didn't warn. He just stood there, feet apart, one hand resting on his belt as if daring gravity to get in the way. Officer Doyle, not young, not old, just the kind of man who thought the uniform was a reason to stop pretending. His eyes scanned Elijah top to bottom, slow, calculating, like examining something left in the gutter. His mouth curled, not quite a smirk, not quite a sneer. "Where you headed with that pile of scrap, old man?" Doyle said it loud enough to cut through traffic noise, loud enough that it didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like territory being pissed on. Elijah didn't move, didn't answer. His hand gripped the throttle, not tight, not jerky, just secure, like he was checking if the engine could still respond if it needed to. The motion was fluid, reflexive, from a man who once slept with sand in his lungs and reflexes sharp enough to wake at the click of a safety being released. His silence wasn't passive. It wasn't polite. It was a wall, unshakable, uninviting, forged through decades of surviving things that didn't leave witnesses. Doyle stepped closer, boots grinding tiny stones beneath him. The way he walked said he'd done this before. The way he looked said he expected submission, or at least explanation. But Elijah didn't blink. His eyes, gray and pale like metal left in the sea, didn't flinch. Doyle studied the silence, maybe mistook it for confusion, maybe didn't understand it was the kind of quiet that survived bombing. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" Doyle asked, his voice sharper now, nudging at the air like a stick into a cage. Still, Elijah didn't respond. The engine coughed once, then returned to idle. His left boot planted firmly, his shadow unmoved. Only the faint creak of his leather glove was audible as he adjusted his grip on the throttle again, precise, patient, as if he had all the time in the world and Doyle had already wasted his. Another gust of wind came, not as strong, but enough to stir dust. The officer's pant legs fluttered. A leaf scraped along the pavement like a whisper. From the driver's seat of the cruiser, a second officer, Roy, remained inside, glancing at his partner but not yet moving, watching, evaluating. The mood had thickened. Something unspoken had entered the space between them, and even Roy could feel it now. Doyle leaned slightly, angling his face closer, trying to read something in Elijah's features. What he saw wasn't anger, wasn't fear, just presence, a kind of weight that refused to be dismissed. The older man looked not at Doyle but past him, through him, like the young officer wasn't fully formed enough to be recognized as a threat. "You know," Doyle muttered, softer now, "guys like you think that cap buys you respect." Elijah turned his head slowly, not fast, not sharp, just deliberate. His eyes finally met Doyle's, and there it was, not challenge, not resentment, but something heavier. The look of someone who'd buried friends without coffins, who'd walked through sand soaked in screams. He didn't need the cap to speak for him. He didn't need anything but his spine and his silence. Doyle shifted his weight unconsciously. Something primal in him recoiled, just a little, just enough. Then, to reassert control, he flicked his chin toward the bike. "You know this thing probably violates half a dozen codes. Taillights busted, no plate visible. You planning on dying on it or just trying to get someone else killed first?" Still, no answer. Elijah looked away, eyes returning to the red light, which hadn't changed, like time itself was waiting to see what would happen next. His breath was calm, shoulders steady. The motorcycle vibrated faintly beneath him, as if aware that something ancient and unbending sat in the saddle. The cop narrowed his eyes. "All right, tough guy." His hand hovered near his baton, not drawing it, not yet, just letting it be seen. "Guess we're doing this the long way." He stepped back toward the cruiser, maybe to consult Roy, to escalate. Elijah didn't watch him go. He just adjusted his grip one final time, thumb brushing over the duct tape like checking a pressure point. The light turned green. He didn't move. Not because of fear, not because of weakness, because something older than confrontation held him there. A code, a rhythm, the kind that said, not every insult deserves an answer, but every stare deserves to be held. And in that moment, on that cracked asphalt, between the roar of engines and the hush of authority, it became clear this wasn't about a motorcycle, or a cap, or even an old man taking up space on a dying machine. This was about the line between power and authority, and Elijah Freeman wasn't moving until someone figured out which side they were on. The light had turned green, but the road remained silent. Elijah didn't budge, not from hesitation, not from fear, just as if the signal of society meant less than the signal inside him. Doyle stepped back toward the cruiser, something sour behind his eyes, the kind of irritation that grows when a man expects instant submission and gets stone instead. The driver's door opened with a mechanical thud. Officer Roy stepped out, tall and lean, walking like he owned the concrete he stood on. There was a theatrical flair to his movements, the kind of swagger that comes not from confidence, but from a man who's performed this routine too many times without consequence. He strolled toward Elijah's bike, breathing in exaggeratedly, nostrils flaring like a wolf sniffing for blood. "I smell weed," he announced, loud and flat, like he was reading from a cheap script. "I'm calling it possible narcotics in the air." Doyle chuckled, stepping to the side of the motorcycle like it was a circus prop. He let his baton drop gently onto the torn leather seat with a rhythmic thump-thump, each tap deliberate, each one louder than the last. "Nice ride," he muttered. "Looks like something a junkyard wouldn't even bother to steal." His eyes cut sideways to Roy. "Bet it's held together with spit and PTSD." Elijah reached slowly into his jacket. No sharp movements, no sudden energy, just the economy of a man who knew too well what rapid motion could invite. He pulled out his wallet, cracked from years of sun and friction, and took out a card. His veteran ID, weathered, bent at the corners, still legible. He extended it in his open hand, not in offering but in declaration. Doyle took it, glanced at it for precisely 1 second, then tore it in half with a sneer, and again into quarters. The pieces fluttered down like dirty confetti, landing beside the gutter. "Thank you for your service," Doyle said, his voice dripping sarcasm like battery acid. "But this ain't the sandbox, Chief. Around here, you play by our rules." Roy moved behind Elijah and grabbed the strap of the old canvas backpack strapped to the bike's side. Without asking, without hesitation, he yanked it open and reached in. Medicine bottles clinked. He pulled out a container, examined the label, scoffed, and tossed it to the sidewalk. It rolled twice and stopped near a storm drain. "Heart meds," Roy said loudly. "Or so it says. You'd be surprised how many addicts label their stash like prescriptions." He took a step back and raised his voice theatrically. "Seen a lot of this type in the old rehab shelters. All tough talk and sad stories. End up begging for change and a fix." Still, Elijah said nothing. His body remained centered, weight distributed evenly on the bike. When Doyle, half out of boredom and half out of cruelty, flicked his boot into the kickstand, the bike jolted forward, tilting hard to the left. Before it could fall, Elijah shifted. One knee braced, one movement, calculated and efficient, saved it from collapse. Not hurried, not startled, just necessary. Roy laughed. "Still got some reflexes, huh? Most of you old junkies just let the whole thing crash. Maybe you're the deluxe model." He circled the front, eyes glinting with that ugly light, half challenge, half disgust. "What's the matter, Grandpa? No tongue left to bite off?" The silence broke, but only just. Elijah's voice came low, even, like thunder you almost didn't hear until the sky split open. "I've never been addicted to anything," he said, "except surviving. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be." It cracked the air clean through Doyle's laugh. Roy froze for a heartbeat. Doyle turned, his jaw clenched. The kind of silence that followed wasn't from respect, it was confusion. The unease of men used to dominating the script when someone flips the page. Doyle stepped in close, face inches from Elijah's. "You think that's clever?" he hissed. "You think silence makes you tough? You're a nobody, riding a pile of rust with a fake medal and a sob story. No one cares who you were. This is now." Elijah didn't blink. The wind moved again, this time carrying the sound of distant city life, tires over wet concrete, a horn in the far blocks, the crackle of a radio. But here, in this square of road framed by abuse and arrogance, felt like the whole country was holding its breath. Roy bent down and picked up the heart medication he'd thrown, examined it again, then tossed it harder this time. It bounced off the curb. "Look at that," he said with theatrical disdain. "Hope your ticker holds up through all this. Would hate to see you keel over before the paperwork." Doyle grinned, circling behind Elijah now, baton dragging across the rear fender like a chalk line on a body. "You ever think maybe you came back for nothing?" he whispered. "All those medals, all those years, for this? For a bike that smells like death and a cap no one respects?" Still, Elijah didn't react, not in posture, not in word. His silence was heavier than any threat they'd hurled. It wasn't stoicism, it was a reminder, a mirror, a presence too disciplined to shatter for small men in big costume. Doyle pulled out his phone and started recording. "Smile for the camera," he said, spinning the angle to catch Elijah's face, the wreck of the bike, the old clothes. "America loves a fallen hero, especially one that falls." Roy chimed in, tone mocking. "Maybe the VA will send flowers." The phone kept rolling. Elijah didn't look at the lens. He stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the horizon, like it held something they'd never understand. Then, almost too quiet to catch, he murmured, "You don't know what it is to fall, and you sure as hell don't know what it means to stand back up." Doyle paused, just for a second. His thumb hovered over the stop button. Something about the tone, not the words, hit differently. Roy raised an eyebrow. "What was that?" he asked, half unsure, half baiting. Elijah didn't repeat it. Instead, he turned his head slightly and looked not at them, but through them. as if they were shadows on a road he'd already walked and bled on and buried better men beside, as if their uniforms were nothing more than stitched delusions, as if the law they pretended to wield had never earned the right to confront him. Doyle stepped forward sharply, trying to grab the moment back. "Is that a threat?" "No," Elijah said simply. "That's the last warning." Roy laughed again, but it came hollow. "This guy thinks he's still in the war." Elijah looked at Roy then, just briefly. "For some of us, it never ended." And that was it. No shouting, no retaliation, no plea. Just one man, surrounded by uniforms, who didn't know that silence can be louder than 1,000 bullets, who didn't know that some people stop talking because they've already said everything that matters with the way they live. The street didn't change, the world didn't shift, but something they couldn't name, moved in that moment. A wire pulled tighter, a fuse clicked into place, the kind of pause before history clears its throat. And for all their noise, their props, their power, Doyle and Roy hadn't managed to move him an inch. They'd only managed to show the world who they were. Two men yelling into a silence that judged them far more than they could ever punish. Roy didn't speak this time. He didn't need words. The twist of his mouth said everything. He stepped forward, lifted his boot, and kicked the cap from Elijah's head. It didn't just fall, it flew, spun like an insult torn loose from decades of wear, landed in a patch of gravel and oil-stained water by the curb. The faded cloth, the frayed seams, the ghost of U.S. Navy, now nearly erased, settled like a relic nobody here cared to remember. Doyle smirked. Roy laughed, sharp and hollow, but Elijah moved as if none of it touched him. No bark of outrage, no rush to retaliate. He stepped off the bike, each motion deliberate, each joint creaking like a war drum muffled under flesh. He walked the short distance with a gravity that made the sidewalk seem sacred, and when he knelt, not fell, not stumbled, but knelt, he picked up the cap with both hands, cupping it as though it weighed its fibers. As he rose, slow and straight-backed, the afternoon light caught his wrists. That's when Doyle saw it. A scar, thick and pale, slicing down the underside of Elijah's right arm. Not jagged, surgical, like someone tried to carve something out of him and left the signature behind. Doyle squinted. "Who sliced you up like that? Some cartel punk or just friendly fire?" Elijah turned his head, not too fast, and met Doyle's gaze without blinking. "Might have been one of mine. Might have been one of yours. I stopped keeping score once the bleeding wouldn't stop." Roy let out a snort. "Jesus. What are you, some action movie backstory? What's next? Tactical flashbacks and slow memories?" Elijah glanced down at the cap in his hands, then up again. "I'm not a hero. I'm just the guy who lived long enough to remember." The words dropped heavy, not shouted, not bitten, just laid out like ammunition across a table. There if someone dared pick it up. Doyle didn't. He closed the distance instead, reached out and grabbed Elijah by the collar, a tight fist twisting the fabric as if trying to strangle a legacy with fingers alone. The force pulled the old man half a step forward, but there was no resistance. Elijah let him. The posture didn't break. The breath didn't quicken. Doyle sneered. "You think that story buys you a free pass? Think you're untouchable because you crawled through some sandpit back in the day?" Elijah didn't answer. He calmly reached up, adjusted the crumpled edge of his collar with 2 fingers, then let it go. Like Doyle's grip wasn't worth the energy to fight or fear. Like dignity didn't need protection. It just needed presence. Roy moved behind him, eyes scanning, a predator looking for new angles. He reached toward Elijah's back pocket, fingers twitching, ready to flip the man's dignity inside out just to see what would fall. But the moment Roy leaned in, Elijah moved. Not violently, not even forcefully, just one pivot of the hips, sharp, fluid, practiced. Roy's hand missed its mark by an inch and recoiled. He staggered slightly, surprised, blinking like he'd just triggered something he didn't understand. Doyle saw it, the shift, the reflex, the kind of instinct that doesn't come from self-defense seminars or police training. It came from nights too long, fire too close, and enemies too many to count. He raised his eyebrows. "Still got some fight in you, huh?" His tone tried for amusement, but there was a sliver of caution now, thin. but growing. Elijah's voice cut through the air, slow and final. I fight until no one gets to shame me and walk away from it. There was no threat in the delivery, no teeth, no roar, just the hard edge of a fact laid down like a line in the sand, silent, solid, irreversible. Doyle stepped back, not because he was afraid, but because the balance had shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough for the moment to feel heavier in the chest. He glanced at Roy, who was rubbing the back of his hand, pretending it didn't sting. "What's with this guy?" Roy muttered. "He's like a statue that bites." Doyle didn't reply. He looked again at the scar, the cap, the unwavering posture of a man whose boots had once sunk into places neither of them would dare imagine. Then he smirked, trying to take back the moment. "You know what your problem is, Freeman?" he asked. "You think the past gives you armor, but out here, the only thing that protects you is relevance." Elijah nodded once, slowly, as if giving space for the statement to breathe and then die on its own. "Relevance is for politicians," he said. "What I carry doesn't fade, just because you don't understand it." Roy's laugh was louder now, forced. "Is this guy serious? What do you even carry, old man? A bunch of stories and rusty bones?" Elijah stepped forward, not aggressive, not even direct, just one step that seemed to draw the whole world an inch closer. He looked between the two officers, the sun at his back casting a long shadow across the patrol car's chrome bumper. "I carry the names of men who didn't make it home. I carry silence where they used to laugh. I carry the weight of seeing too much and the burden of having survived it." Roy blinked. The laughter stopped. Doyle clenched his jaw. "You talk like you matter." Elijah tilted his head. "I talk like I remember." The moment held. No one moved. Even the street seemed to pause. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance. A horn blared 2 blocks away. But here, in this cracked strip of pavement where a cap had fallen, where old hands still remembered how to move before thought could catch up, it felt like the country itself was listening. Roy took another step forward, searching for something to say, something to break the stare that had started to make him itch. "So what's your deal? You think you're some kind of martyr? Some relic that deserves respect just because you're too stubborn to die?" Elijah looked at him with a calm that wasn't peace. It was something colder, something forged under shell fire and betrayal. "I don't want respect," he said. "I want decency, and if that's too much, I'll settle for not being treated like trash by boys who never earned the right to speak about war." The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full, like a pressure drop before a storm. Doyle opened his mouth, but the words caught. Roy looked away. The old man didn't need to swing or shout or threaten. He had already drawn blood, just not the kind you see. And the street remembered it. The curb remembered it. The cap, now dusted off and cradled in Elijah's hands, remembered it. They didn't know yet, but something irreversible had happened, and neither of them would be the same again. The silence from before didn't break. It shifted, coiled tighter, drawing blood without a blade. Roy stood back, shook off his unease, and raised his phone like it was a badge, like it gave him power over truth. The screen framed Elijah's face, worn and steady beneath the battered cap now back on his head. Roy grinned. "Let's go viral, hero," he said, voice slathered in contempt. "Anyone watching this and still thinks you used to be a soldier, they're blind." The red recording light blinked. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze cut through the lens like glass on bone. The camera didn't catch bravado or fear, only stillness, like the kind found in old ruins or old warriors. Then Elijah spoke, voice slow but crystalline. "Who do you think will watch this?" Roy blinked, thrown off by the calm. "What?" I said. Elijah repeated, each syllable heavier than bullets. "Who do you think will see this clip?" The words didn't come with a threat. They came with inevitability. Roy's grin faltered. Doyle barked out a laugh behind him, but even that had an edge now, less joy, more noise. "People online," he spat, trying to reclaim the moment. "Radical clowns. Keyboard patriots." Elijah's eyes didn't leave the lens. "Good," he said, "just enough to make sure you don't sleep through the night again." The camera was still rolling, but Roy's arm lowered slightly. He didn't know why, Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the way Elijah's silence carried more warning than their voices ever could. But the crack had opened, and Doyle, desperate to close it, walked forward, boots heavy on the pavement, carrying anger like a torch. He snatched the cap off Elijah's head without warning, ripped it like peeling back a scar. "Let's see how much this means to you," he growled. With 2 fingers, he dangled the fabric like something he found in a sewer, then leaned over and spat into it, thick, wet, deliberate. The saliva hit dead center. The fabric absorbed it like an insult too old to fight. Doyle let it drop. It hit the asphalt with a soft thud that sounded louder than it should have. Elijah didn't move right away. He looked down at it for a full 5 seconds, the weight of history staining his silence. Then, with the same poise that had carried him through everything before, he stepped forward, crouched slowly, and picked it up, 2 fingers brushing dirt from the brim like brushing dust from a folded flag. Roy lifted his phone again, but Doyle beat him to the next humiliation. He pulled out his own, flipped the camera, and stepped beside Elijah. "Smile," he mocked. "Let's show the world what happens when legends rust." The shutter clicked, loud, sharp, final. Doyle smirked into the screen, then turned it around, satisfied with the frame. Elijah looked at him, voice colder than steel. "I've seen men laugh like that, right before a round sliced their skulls open like fruit." Doyle's grin froze, his body tensed. "Say that again?" I said. Elijah repeated, "I've seen your face before. In men who thought the war was entertainment, who thought the gun was always in their hand until it wasn't." The laugh died. The moment shifted again. It didn't explode, it deepened, the way the sky deepens right before a storm. Cracks it open. Doyle stepped back slightly, trying not to show it. He locked eyes with Elijah, jaw tight, and hissed, "You want to try something, old man? Try it. One more time." It wasn't a dare. It was a bluff soaked in fear. Elijah didn't take a step. He didn't lift a hand. He didn't need to. His stare alone was a mirror, and what Doyle saw in it wasn't weakness. It was a legacy, and it was watching. Roy looked away. His phone dropped to his side. For the first time, there was no comment, no joke, no sneer, just the creak of doubt settling into boots that had never stood where Elijah once stood. "You think you scare us?" Doyle spat. "You think standing still makes you powerful?" Elijah took a breath, not to center himself, but to let the moment breathe its last. "You're not scared of me," he said. "You're scared of who might still remember me." It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy. Doyle's face twitched. "No one's coming for you." Elijah looked around the empty street, then back at Doyle. "I never said they were." Another silence fell, but this one wasn't just tension. It was recognition. Something was gathering, something bigger than pride, louder than shame, and they felt it. They didn't know from where or when or who, but they felt it, like thunder from a distance. Doyle bent down as if to pick something up, maybe the last of his self-respect. Then he stood, face red, eyes hard. "You keep talking about memory, about people who'll come. But there's no one here, old man, just us." Elijah smiled. "Not wide, just enough cut." "Good," he said. "Then there'll be no one to stop what's already coming." Doyle took a step back. His mouth opened, then closed. The camera light went off. Doyle didn't blink. His body was rigid, like his nerves had caught up with his mouth and started asking questions his pride couldn't answer. "I've seen war," Elijah said, voice even. "I've carried brothers out of hell without a promise I'd get one step further. You think I'm afraid of humiliation? I've watched better men bleed out trying to protect the people you're mocking." Doyle clenched his fists. "You want to fight?" "No," Elijah said. "You already lost it." The air thickened. Asphalt under their feet held more than their weight. It held a warning. No sirens, no shouts, just the slow, creeping realization that the man they tried to reduce had never shrunk, that their uniforms couldn't command what they didn't understand. Doyle took one last look at the phone in his hand, at the image frozen on the screen. Elijah's face, calm, measured, not afraid. Then he hit delete. Roy looked at him, uncertain. "What are you doing?" Doyle didn't answer, because for once, he didn't know. And Elijah, still holding the cap, now stained and tattered, placed it gently back on his head. The brim shadowed his eyes, but nothing could hide the light behind them. Not rage, not revenge, just history, and the certainty that somewhere, someone, still remembered his name. The cap, now tainted and wrinkled, sat firm on Elijah's head as he stood silent amid the concrete and contempt. He didn't wipe it clean. He didn't adjust it for comfort. He wore it the way soldiers wear scars, unhidden, unyielding. The air between them thickened, not from heat but from something colder, shame trying to pass itself off as authority. Doyle stood closest, fists clenched, eyes scanning Elijah's stillness like it offended gravity. Then Elijah spoke, not low, not loud, just precise. The words dropped one by one as if chiseled from somewhere deeper than memory. My name, he said, was carved into the memorial wall in Fallujah, a stone that says I died, but here I am. The sentence didn't seek awe. It wasn't nostalgia. It was a blow landed without a fist. Doyle narrowed his eyes, face twitching into something between mockery and discomfort. So what? He sneered. You came back from the dead to ride that scrap metal to a free checkup? Elijah turned, not to answer the insult but to look at the motorcycle. Battered, humming quietly, the duct tape and rust like battle ribbons no one had pinned. Then he looked back at Doyle. I came back to see for myself, he said, that justice still doesn't wear a uniform. Roy scoffed. You think this is about justice? You're lucky we didn't impound that bucket of bolts and drag your wrinkled ass to the precinct. Elijah didn't flinch. You confuse justice with procedure. That's why men like you wear badges and think they're shields. Doyle's face flushed. He stepped forward, baton in hand, and let it fall gently, rhythmically against the tank of Elijah's bike. Not hard, not yet, just enough to leave dents of warning. One tap, then another, then another. The sound echoed, a metronome of slow violence. Anything else you want to say? He asked, voice cold, before we cuff you for being a pain in our street. Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head toward the rearview mirror on his left. The chrome reflected half of his face, the hard line of his jaw, the pale eyes set deep under a brow built by war. In the background of that reflection, Doyle, blurry, arrogant, unaware he was already being measured by something older than policy. I came home to find out, Elijah said slowly, still watching himself in the mirror, which lasts longer. This cap I wear, or the badge you carry? The baton stopped tapping. Roy stepped up, the chain of the handcuffs dangling like a toy of threat. He flicked the latch and let the steel mouth open with a sharp click. You're pushing it, old man. I've been pushed farther, Elijah said, and by men who didn't need badges to be dangerous. Doyle leaned in, voice low now. You want to test us? Elijah looked at him, calm as stone. You already failed. Roy raised the cuffs, let them hang in front of Elijah like a prize, then shook them slightly. The sound was soft, too soft for the drama they tried to impose. Let's go. You're under arrest for whatever we feel like today. Doyle smirked, feeding off the moment. Got any last words before you ride the back seat of a car you're not allowed to touch? Elijah turned his eyes away from both of them, just slightly, as if recalling a face only he could still see. Then he said, with a voice that sliced through their sneers, Tell Hanley I said hello. Everything stopped. Roy's hand froze midair. Doyle's expression cracked, only for a second, but long enough. A fissure opened behind his eyes, a fracture of recognition that shattered all certainty. What? Doyle asked, but it came out quieter than intended. Elijah stepped forward, not threatening, not fast, just close enough for his voice to land sharper. If you remember who that is, then you already know you're not qualified to arrest me. Roy lowered the cuffs slightly. You know Hanley? Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way he said the name had already answered everything. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't flexing. He was remembering. And Doyle was the one struggling to forget. The baton, still resting against the motorcycle tank, slipped slightly. Doyle caught it, but didn't continue the rhythm. The taps had lost their beat. Roy took a half step back, glancing at Doyle now for cues instead of orders. You're bluffing. Doyle muttered. "You're just dropping names." Elijah lifted his eyes, the mirror catching a glint again. "You don't forget the man who dragged you out of hell. And you don't forget the ones who watch from safety. No threats, no shouting. Just words strung like a sniper's breath before the pole." Roy swallowed. The steel in his hands felt colder. Doyle's grip on the baton tightened, but his stance didn't shift forward. Not anymore. "Why'd you come back?" Roy asked, his voice now trying for reason, for ground. Elijah turned, the cap's shadow covering half his face. "I came back to see if the country I bled for still bled for its own." Doyle scoffed again, but it was weaker now, hollow. "That's rich. You think you're some kind of martyr, some legend that still walks?" Elijah smiled, but it wasn't warm. "I think I'm the mistake your system made when it declared me dead too early." The baton fell to Doyle's side. The cuffs stayed in Roy's hand, unmoved. The street, once their stage, had turned into something else, something quieter, something heavier. And the man they tried to erase, he stood there, not just unbroken, but bearing witness to their unraveling. The baton hung loose in Doyle's hand, his voice no longer ready, his mouth no longer sharp. And in the vacuum that followed Elijah's last words, something changed. Not in the people, not even in the light, but in the air itself. A hum began to swell from the distance, too low at first to register as a threat, too steady to be ordinary. But Elijah's posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough. His fingers brushed the seat of his motorcycle, not like checking equipment, more like bracing for a memory that might just return wearing teeth. The sound grew. It wasn't the high whine of sirens or the dull purr of patrol cars. It was deeper, bass-heavy, slow, methodical, like steel moving across earth, like war machines rolling through dust they thought they'd buried. The kind of sound you felt before you heard. Doyle turned his head sharply. "What the hell is that?" No one answered. The hum crawled closer, vibrating through the soles of their boots, rising in frequency like a breath held too long. Roy stepped back, eyes narrowing toward the western edge of the avenue, where the sun caught on movement, shadows larger than trucks, broader than jeeps. Then came the growl, not the sound of one engine, but several, a chorus, and unmistakably military. Doyle stiffened. "They're running some kind of drill." His voice cracked mid-sentence, not from fear, at least not the kind he could name, but from something more primal. Something is born when prey realizes it doesn't know what kind of hunter is coming. Elijah smiled, the first smile since the beginning, subtle, crooked, and devastating. It didn't mock, it didn't taunt, it just confirmed. Roy's hand moved slowly to the grip of his sidearm. "What is it?" he asked, tone no longer performative. "What's happening?" Elijah didn't look at him. His eyes stayed forward, watching something rise into view that only he recognized with that kind of knowing. "I'm not sure," he said, voice light as air and twice as heavy, "but I've heard that sound before, just before the chopper came to pull us out of hell." Doyle turned completely now, head craning back. The first Humvee emerged from behind the corner, moving like a beast out of time, matte tan with no sirens, no flash, just mass and intent. Roy pulled his radio, clicked twice. "Unit 12 requesting an update," he said. "Unit 12 requesting confirmation of military presence at..." Static. No voice returned. He clicked again. Nothing. Just white noise and a soft hiss, like breath held at the edge of panic. The second Humvee appeared, slower than the first. No markings except for a single black number stenciled on the door. Elijah's fingers tightened on the bike seat. The wind kicked up, out of nowhere, sudden and precise, like something remembered its timing. Leaves scattered across the asphalt, scraping along the gutter in spirals, tumbling like dog tags across stone. Doyle swallowed. "Why aren't they answering?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "What the hell kind of drill is this?" Elijah's voice was calm, almost soft. "It's not a drill." Roy's hand gripped the radio tightly. "Then what is it?" Elijah's eyes stayed locked on the oncoming caravan. It's memory, coming back with a steel heartbeat. The wind blew harder now, lifting dust into the air. Street debris rose like smoke from a battlefield. The Humvees didn't slow. They didn't veer. They didn't look like part of any organized parade. They looked like a judgment. And they were headed straight for the blockade Doyle and Roy had created. Roy took 2 steps backward. Who the hell authorized this? Elijah looked down, touched the side of his motorcycle gently, and nodded to himself, like confirming a truth no one else could see. Not everyone who remembers wears a uniform anymore, he said, but some of us never stopped standing. Doyle turned to Roy, something like desperation in his eyes. Try dispatch again. Roy pressed the button. Dispatch, come in. Static. He changed channels. District Command confirmed the situation at more static. A hiss. Then silence. No one answered. Not from the city, not from the precinct, not from the system they thought was watching their backs. Doyle stepped away from the bike, baton still in hand, but now it hung lower, almost reluctant. I don't like this. Elijah lifted his gaze to the sky, where the late sun had begun to bleed into orange. Neither did we. That's how we knew something real was coming. A third Humvee turned onto the block. The engines growled like dogs waking from chains. The wind kicked up again, sharper this time, tugging at Doyle's collar, lifting the edges of his sleeves. Roy flinched when a newspaper blew into his leg. The world wasn't loud, it was alive, and in that living moment, the air began to feel hunted. Doyle looked up, scanned the rooftops. Feels like, Roy whispered at first, feels like we're being watched. Elijah didn't deny it. He just nodded, eyes still forward. That's because you are. Doyle spun around. By who? Elijah reached up, slowly, adjusted his cap, and said, the people who remember what silence looked like before it exploded. Another pause. Then Doyle muttered, this feels wrong. Elijah turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Doyle in the corner of his eye. That's your conscience. It's trying to catch up. Doyle stared, breathing shallowly now. He looked again toward the growing line of vehicles. Soldiers weren't visible yet, but something was. Something in the way the doors stayed shut, the way the windows remained blacked out, the way no sirens screamed, but nothing moved to stop them. Roy spoke, barely audible. We shouldn't be here. Elijah stepped once, slowly, and placed his palm flat on the bike seat, not to brace, not to mount, just to connect, like grounding his presence to the frame that had carried him this far. He didn't need armor. He had already been in armor for others. Doyle whispered, as if afraid the street might hear. This feels like a setup. Elijah chuckled. The sound was dry. Sandpaper and sun. If it is, he said, it started years ago, when you decided a badge made you better than the people who bled for it. The Humvees stopped. All 3. No screech, no ceremony, just silence. Worse than noise. And behind that silence, the past waited. Armed not with guns, but with memory. The Humvees didn't roar to a stop. They settled, as if the pavement itself had been holding its breath, and only now dared exhale. Their engines idled, with a sound too calm to be anything but deliberate. Power restrained, not because it was unsure, but because it knew exactly what it was doing. The first door opened with no urgency, no slam, no theatrical burst, just the click of confidence. A polished boot touched the concrete, then the second, and then the man. Captain Hanley stepped out. He wasn't decorated with medals or wrapped in theater. His presence alone was a declaration. The cut of his uniform was precise, but not showy. His stance was straight, but not stiff. And the moment his boots met the street, his eyes found Elijah. No scan, no delay, no question. Like a compass finally returning to true north. Hanley walked forward, each step balanced with weight and purpose. The soldiers behind him stayed in the vehicles. They didn't need to be told. This wasn't a raid. This was something else. Something sacred. His voice broke the silence, low but unshakable. Who, Hanley said, permitted you to put your hands on the man who saved my life? Doyle flinched. Not physically, but his bravado cracked, like a windshield finally giving under pressure. His reply was instinctive, stammered. We didn't know who he was. Hanley didn't respond. He didn't even look at Doyle. He kept walking, past the trembling baton, past Roy, who had backed 2 steps without knowing it, past the bike, still humming softly like it knew the moment mattered. He moved until he stood before Elijah. The wind picked up again. The cap on Elijah's head, still weathered, stained, carried the memory of all 5 parts of the silence that came before. This time the wind won. It lifted the cap, peeled it off like a whisper of the past being released. It landed near Hanley's foot. Hanley looked at it. He bent slowly, not out of age, but out of reverence, and picked it up with both hands. He didn't brush it off. He didn't smooth the fabric. He simply turned to Elijah, and with the same care one might place a flag on a casket, positioned the cap back on Elijah's head. Then he straightened and shouted, "Company, attention!" Inside the Humvees, movement erupted like a synchronized breath. Doors opened. Boots struck the pavement. A line of soldiers formed in seconds, posture perfect, shoulders squared, eyes front. Not one of them questioned the order. Not one of them needed to be told who the man was. Doyle panicked. His fingers twitched. His hand flew to his holster. The pistol cleared the leather 1/2 inch. "Don't," Hanley said without turning. The tone was not loud, but it was final. Doyle froze. His knuckles whitened, caught between instinct and consequence. Slowly, he let the pistol slide back down. The snap of the holster's return was deafening in the silence. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't salute. He just nodded. Once, Hanley turned his head slightly, enough for only Elijah to see his expression shift. Just enough, a flicker of gratitude, of apology, of something private and unrepeatable. "I thought you were dead," Hanley said. "Turns out it's this country that died before you." Roy's lips moved, but no words came. Finally, a whisper cracked through the fear. We messed up." Hanley didn't turn to him either. His eyes never left Elijah, because this wasn't about the apology. It was about acknowledgement, about giving the moment what it deserved: silence, discipline, and the refusal to look away from truth. The soldiers didn't speak. They didn't twitch. They just stood, in perfect formation, for one man, not because he outranked them, because he outlasted them, because in his silence they saw everything their uniforms were supposed to mean, and everything they'd forgotten in the noise of orders and ego. The cap stayed on Elijah's head, unmoved by the wind now. It no longer needed to fight the weather. It was exactly where it was meant to be. Doyle, hand still hovering near his belt, looked between the soldiers and the man he had tried to humiliate. The weight of his mistakes settled in like a vest too heavy to remove. He didn't say anything, because nothing he could say would matter anymore. And as the sun dipped lower behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the rows of uniforms and the single man they honored, one truth stood untouched. Honor doesn't shout. It stands, even when everything else falls. The silence hadn't moved. The soldiers hadn't flinched. But the ground under Doyle's boots no longer felt like it belonged to him. His breath was shallow, his grip on the baton limp. Hanley didn't look at him when he stepped forward. His eyes stayed locked on Elijah. One hand reached into the inside of his jacket and retrieved a sealed folder, the military insignia bold across its face, the paper stiff with purpose. He walked with the steadiness of a man who wasn't bringing punishment, but confirmation of a truth that should have never been ignored. Doyle's jaw twitched. He didn't need the paper opened to know what it meant. He saw it in Hanley's posture, in the quiet of the street, in the steady presence of Elijah still standing untouched after all they'd thrown at him. The illusion was over. The badge on Doyle's chest now weighed like an anchor pulling him under. Hanley broke the seal without ceremony and unfolded the single page. As of this moment, Officer Doyle is formally suspended pending a full investigation into misconduct, abuse of authority, and the public humiliation of a decorated veteran. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It rang louder because it didn't tremble. Then, to Doyle, "You will sign here." Doyle stared at the page. His fingers didn't move, his pride gripped tightly then sense. "I'm not signing anything," he hissed, voice thinner now, sharpened by fear, not defiance. Hanley didn't argue. He simply nodded once. Two soldiers stepped forward, clean, calm, like gears in a machine that had done this before. Doyle took one step back, but the motion was more stumble than a choice. Before he could react further, they seized his arms and forced them down onto the hood of his patrol car. Metal met metal. The baton dropped to the pavement with a dull clatter. One soldier pinned his left wrist, the other pressed down on his right forearm. No violence, just control, the kind of control Doyle had thought only belonged to men like him. Until now. His voice cracked. "You don't have the authority." Hanley approached, placed the paper on the patrol car's hood, and slid a pen beside it. "Authority isn't always loud," he said. "Sometimes it just stands still and waits for men like you to lose control." Elijah stepped forward. Not fast, not slow, just still. Each step was a sentence. Each breath is a reckoning. He moved until he stood beside Doyle, who was now bent over the hood like a man caught not just in the act, but in the truth of who he was. Elijah looked at him for a long moment. No malice, just clarity. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, like explaining something that had already happened. "You asked me once what I did in Fallujah." Doyle didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the hood. Elijah continued. "I held my hands like this, palms forward, knees bent, shoulders locked, because I was gripping the stock of a rifle so tight my bones ached for weeks. I held that rifle so the others could run, so Hanley could walk again, so someone could come home." He looked down at Doyle's restrained arms. "Now, I hold my hands this way," he said, "so you can't lay yours on anyone else." No one spoke. Even Roy didn't breathe. Hanley gave a subtle gesture with two fingers. Roy, still standing a few feet back, lowered himself to his knees. It wasn't grace. It wasn't surrender. It was safety protocol. But the symbolism was undeniable. The man who had mocked Elijah's scars now knelt on the same street where he'd once laughed at them. Hanley turned, scanning the bystanders. Only soldiers now, no audience, no press. He raised a hand and made a slicing motion across his throat. "Cameras, radios, body cams, all shut off. No live stream," he said. "No press releases. Honor doesn't need an audience." Doyle clenched his jaw tighter, his breathing now shallow and uneven. The corners of his mouth twitched as if words were trying to form, but the only thing left was the sound of him swallowing what little pride hadn't already bled out. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't preach. He simply turned his body slightly, reached down, and touched the seat of his motorcycle. The machine coughed, then growled, then roared. The engine, dormant for too long, sparked to life like a memory too loud to stay buried. Its sound wasn't just mechanical, it was defiance, revival. The same bike they mocked now throbbed with the heartbeat of something they couldn't stop. Roy looked up, the kneeling position tightening in his knees. He watched as Elijah stepped back beside the bike, not to flee, not to end anything, just to let it breathe again. Hanley stepped beside him, voice low. "We didn't come here to punish them." "I know," Elijah replied. Hanley nodded. "We came because some men are still worth standing for." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to, because that's what he'd been doing since the beginning. The engine of the motorcycle still vibrated behind them. Not loud, not boasting, just steady, like breath returning to lungs that had once collapsed under too many names carved in stone. Elijah stood with his hand resting lightly on the seat, not to support himself, but as a reminder. He was still here, not just standing, but present, and not because he needed to be seen, but because others needed to see. Hanley didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He just looked at Roy, the quiet weight of memory pressing into every syllable. "That man," Hanley said, his tone neither soft nor sharp, "once shielded my body with his own when I couldn't stand. A sniper round shattered the top of my femur. Blood was in my boots before I even hit the ground, and his eyes flicked to Elijah, then back. He didn't move, not a step. He stayed kneeling over me while rounds cracked the dirt beside his knees. He stayed until the Black Hawk landed. He stayed until I could walk again. Roy's eyes dropped, not from guilt, from something colder, realization, not just that he had crossed a line, but that the man he'd tried to humiliate was the only reason another man had survived to stop him. Behind them, Doyle exhaled hard. His hands were still on the hood of the cruiser, but the fight had left his body. His mouth opened. No words came. Then, like a crack in old marble, his jaw trembled, and the tears came, not as repentance, but as resignation, not because he understood the pain he caused, but because he knew. His uniform was no longer a shield, it was a verdict. Elijah didn't look at him. He lifted his face to the sky, cloudless, vast, and closed his eyes, not to escape, not to pray, just to be. The sun brushed across his brow, and for a moment he looked not like a man coming back, but like a man who had never truly left. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he simply existed in a stillness no one could interrupt. A voice, small and unsure, broke the quiet. One of the younger soldiers, barely 20, boots still too clean, took a step forward. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it halfway, as though asking permission to speak in a sacred space. "Sir," the young man asked, voice cracked. Is it you?" Elijah opened his eyes, turned slightly, and nodded once. "I used to be," he said. "Now I'm just here to see what kind of men you decide to become." The words landed with more weight than any order. The soldier stood straighter, not because he was told to, but because he understood something had shifted, that the man in front of him wasn't a myth. He was a memory that walked. Roy stepped forward then, slowly, hands open. His mouth pressed into a line, throat working hard to form the words. I'm sorry," he managed, "for everything." Elijah looked at him, not with anger, not with comfort, just with a stare that held the burden of too many wars and not enough truth. "Don't be sorry," Elijah said. "Be different. And remember this, the next time you see someone who's survived more than you." Roy nodded, slowly, the kind of nod that didn't erase the past, but accepted it. Henley turned slightly, his voice low but deliberate. He didn't say Mr. Freeman. He didn't say sir. He said only 2 words, and when he said them, the entire line of soldiers snapped to a deeper stillness. "Senior Chief." Elijah stood straight. Straighter than any man his age had a right to. Straighter than most men ever would. And then, with no hesitation, he raised his right hand and delivered a salute. Not to Hanley, not to the soldiers, but to the silence behind them, to the past, to the names still etched in his memory, if not on his skin. The soldiers returned it. All of them. No one moved. No one dared blink because what they were witnessing wasn't protocol. It was resurrection. It was a man, declared dead in some forgotten file, reclaiming his place not through shouting, not through violence, but through presence. When Elijah lowered his hand, there was no applause, no roar, just breathe, just understanding. And as he turned back toward his bike, resting his hand once more on the throttle, something fundamental had changed. Not in him, but in the way they saw him, not as a veteran, not even as a symbol, but as a standard, a living one, the kind of man who didn't need a headline to be history. The roar of the engine faded behind them, but its echo settled in every chest like a pulse too stubborn to die. Elijah rode off, slow but unshaken, the tail of his coat flicking with each gentle lurch of the aging motorcycle. He didn't look back, didn't glance at the formation of soldiers that remained frozen, statues of regret and respect carved from bone and memory. The road ahead curved gently, vanishing into a tree line where morning sun sliced through branches like knives of gold. He rode into it not as a man fleeing something, but as a man who had already stayed too long to prove what never should have been questioned. That was when the confrontation. Hanley stood at the shoulder of the street, eyes fixed on the diminishing silhouette until it dissolved behind the trees. He didn't speak. None of them did. Beside him, Doyle was being led away, cuffed and mute, his face drained of anything but the ashen weight of everything he'd just lost. As they passed the rows of rigid soldiers, Doyle turned his head, not to plead, not to explain, but just to catch one last glimpse of a man who had somehow ripped the mask off power without lifting a hand. His lips trembled, but no apology came. None would have mattered now. Roy didn't speak either. His mouth opened once, as if a final word might surface, but it didn't. He lowered his gaze, clenched his jaw, and followed the escort in silence. What could he say that didn't reek of convenience or cowardice? What could he offer a man like Elijah that wouldn't feel like trying to mop blood with paper? In the language of dignity, sometimes silence is the only honest thing left. Elijah's home was quiet. The front porch sagged under years of weather and neglect, and the screen door creaked like an old throat clearing. He parked the bike with a slow reverence, letting the engine click into cooling silence. As he stepped inside, the sun caught the curve of his scarred wrist, the one that no longer needed to be hidden. At the sink, he turned the faucet with deliberate calm, letting water run over his hands, the clean warmth tracing over sinew and old wounds. For the first time in years, he didn't instinctively pull his sleeve down. He dried his hands on a towel older than most apologies, and moved to the small table near the window. There, next to a worn tin ashtray and a cracked mug that hadn't seen coffee in weeks, he placed the faded U.S. Navy cap down gently. The cloth was soft with age, its threads clinging to meaning by memory alone. He stared at it for a second, then raised his eyes to the photograph mounted above the table. The frame was simple. Inside it, a younger Elijah stared back from a decade-long buried uniform, crisp, posture defiant, a desert behind him that had swallowed better men whole. Around him were faces now reduced to names, carved in stone or forgotten by governments that praised them only on paper. He smiled, not a proud smile, but a quiet one, the kind that says, "I'm still here, and that should terrify you more than any flag." A knock came, not loud, just 3 soft taps, followed by the whisper of mail sliding under the door. Elijah walked over, bent slowly, and picked up the envelope. The seal on it was real, official, wax-stamped, no return address. He didn't open it right away. He returned to the table, sat down, and placed the envelope beside the hat. Then he looked out the window. Nothing waited out there, nothing needed to. At the same time, across town, a headline appeared in the digital edition of a respected newspaper: "The Dead Man Who Made a Nation Stand Still." Beneath it, a photo, grainy, tilted, but unmistakable, of Elijah, upright and silent, surrounded by uniforms that suddenly looked less like authority and more like apology. He didn't read it, never would. That was for others. Inside the military base, Handley remained rooted for another long minute before turning away. He gave no orders. The men behind him still stood at attention. One of them whispered to the soldier beside him, "What now?" But no answer came. Orders didn't mean much when dignity had spoken. Doyle was processed without incident. The usual paperwork, the standard questions, the hollow rubber stamp of bureaucracy shuffling guilt into archives. He didn't fight it, he didn't resist. But in the holding cell, with concrete walls pressing closer than guilt itself, he sat down slowly, placed his head in his hands, and didn't move for hours. Not from shame, but because there was nothing left to perform. Roy sat alone outside the debriefing room, holding a blank notepad in his lap. The pages stared back at him, daring him to make sense of it. He had spent years writing incident reports, complaints, and procedural statements designed to buffer the blow of misconduct. Today, he couldn't even write a sentence. The only line in his head belonged to Elijah. "I've never been addicted to anything except survive." It looped in his brain like a sentence carved in a loop of barbed wire. Back in Elijah's kitchen, the letter still sat unopened. He made no move to touch it. Whatever it offered, recognition, ceremony, a carefully worded apology from someone too high to bleed, it wouldn't change anything. Men like him didn't live for medals. They lived despite them. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it slowly, watching the way light refracted through the glass like shrapnel in slow motion. Outside, the air had turned quiet again. The wind had died, but the silence was not peace, it was anticipation, the breath held before a truth echoes. Elijah sat back, exhaled, and rested his hand over the envelope. He didn't open it, but his fingers pressed lightly on it, as if weighing the gesture rather than the content. After a moment, he pushed it aside and reached for his old radio. He turned the knob gently. Static hissed, then broke into a low, clear jazz station. Horns soft, drums restrained. He nodded once, to no one in particular, as if confirming the day had ended, not in triumph, but in endurance. The chair beneath him creaked and he leaned back, letting the melody fill the spaces where apologies couldn't reach. Behind him, the photograph still watched. Somewhere in a Pentagon office, a staffer stared at a blank citation request form. Her superior had told her to update the record for Elijah Freeman. She typed the name. The system blinked. Status: deceased. She frowned, refreshed the page. Same result. Then, slowly, she erased the status and typed living. The cursor blinked for a moment, then she added, recommended for advisory distinction. She paused before submitting it, and then typed one more line, subject declined all commendations. Miles away, in a high-rise government building, a committee reviewed incident footage from the altercation. One advisor leaned forward, voice low. Do you see the way he never once stepped back? That's not defiance, that's architecture. He stood like a pillar. A younger member asked, should we issue a public statement? The reply came cool, no, he already made it for us. With silence. At sunset, Elijah stepped back outside. The wind had returned, faint, restless, as if brushing past to see what he would do next. He didn't move far, just leaned against the porch railing, arms folded, eyes on nothing in particular. The road was empty, the trees whispered, not from wind, but from memory. He could have been a statue, but statues don't bleed. Statues don't survive. He did, and that, more than any medal or folded flag, was the one thing they couldn't undo. It started with no caption. No headline, just an image, a grainy, dust-covered photo printed on page 7 of a military archive bulletin, the kind no one read unless they once wore a uniform. But that photo, it didn't need ink to scream. In it, Elijah Freeman, younger, leaner, blood-stained, and grim, was seen carrying then Private Hanley across an Iraqi battlefield in 2004. The sky behind them bloomed with smoke. Elijah's face was taut, clenched with the singular focus of a man refusing to let death make the final call. Hanley's leg dangled at a sick angle. There was no glory in the frame, no filtered heroism, just grit, just the truth. Someone posted it online. No fanfare, no filter. By noon, it was everywhere. Screens in coffee shops, high school history classes, break room walls in federal buildings. The caption was always the same. He never asked for honor, but he carried it anyway. By sunset, the story outgrew the image. Major networks cut in. Anchors who once dismissed veterans as background segments now cleared primetime slots. 2 officers were suspended amid accusations of abuse against a decorated war hero, one said. The chyron scrolled below. Elijah Freeman, presumed KIA in 2004, resurfaces to confront injustice. And yet, Elijah never said a word. He stayed in his home, quiet. The only change? A steady stream of mail, letters, packages, flags, some folded, some handwritten, none unopened. He kept them on the kitchen table, beneath the same photograph where he and Hanley once stood in front of the Humvee they'd dragged wounded friends into. But outside, a storm was forming, not of weather, but of reckoning. From an office inside the Pentagon, a retired colonel sent a letter, signed and sealed. In 2005, I nominated Senior Chief Elijah Freeman for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was blocked, deemed politically inconvenient. We were told to let it die quietly. It didn't die, it resurrected, louder now than when the bullets were flying. Veteran forums exploded. Then forums turned into coalitions. Within 72 hours, over 50,000 signatures were gathered. Signatures from men and women who had worn the uniform, bled in foreign soil, or buried brothers who didn't come home. The demand was clear. Restore Elijah Freeman's name. Reinstate every commendation stripped. Let the man who never asked for anything finally receive what couldn't be bought or assigned. Honor. In a congressional hearing streamed live, Senator Alton Brooks, staunch conservative, known more for cuts than compassion, sat stiffly before the microphone. He held a printed copy of the now famous photo. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "This man," he said, throat tightening, "this man was forgotten because someone decided he was no longer useful. But I've never seen a man more useful to this nation's soul." The hearing chamber fell silent. The senator wiped a tear without shame. Across media channels, a new detail emerged. Journalists uncovered a memo, long buried, heavily redacted. It confirmed what few had dared suggest. Elijah's name had, for years, appeared on a classified KIA list. Not MIA, not missing, dead, filed, forgotten. And worse, when discovered alive, his reactivation was blocked, not due to policy or process, but optics. He was too inconvenient to resurrect, but the country had done it anyway. Every hour, more layers unraveled. A military historian from Annapolis found records that showed Elijah had not only led 4 successful extractions, but had also rescued enemy combatants in a Red Crescent van under heavy crossfire. The kind of thing no medal covers. The kind of thing you don't do for praise. Meanwhile, Roy and Doyle, names now infamous, found themselves cornered in a way handcuffs never could. The National Veteran Accountability Coalition, a non-government group with deep legal teeth, filed a formal petition, full investigation, federal charges, dishonorable discharge recommendations. Roy went silent. Doyle hired a lawyer. Neither slept well. At a university in South Carolina, students painted a mural of Elijah not with guns or medals, but standing, hands behind his back, scars visible, facing a riot of cameras and flashing lights, with the same calm he'd faced enemy fire. Below the mural, 3 words, still standing silent. Elijah didn't react, didn't hold press conferences. When a national news anchor showed up at his door, he simply nodded and said, "Not today." Then he closed the door and went back to boiling water for tea. At the Department of Veterans Affairs, an internal memo leaked. Elijah Freeman's case had caused a procedural audit across multiple branches. Memos were being pulled, names reassigned, folders relabeled. The system, bloated and slow, had been shaken, not by bombs, not by protests, but by one man who refused to bend when the nation forgot him. And still, he didn't smile. He stood on his porch, one hand resting on the railing, as if steadying a nation too late in finding its balance. Wind moved around him like a whisper from old comrades, not loud, just present. He hadn't reclaimed his place in the world. The world had been forced to remember he never left it. He had spoken more by remaining silent than most men did with speeches. In the days that followed the photo, the headlines, the petitions, and the trembling congressional apologies, Elijah Freeman did exactly what no one expected. He stayed silent. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't post a single word online. He didn't even turn on the news, which couldn't seem to stop talking about him. So when an invitation came, formal, embossed, signed by the chairman of the National Veterans Council, no one knew if he'd show. But he did. He arrived in a plain brown jacket, boots dulled by years, not dirt, with a cloth bag slung over his shoulder that looked like it had carried more than belongings in its time. The room was packed. Flash bulbs blinked like static nerves. Uniforms lined the walls. They stood when he walked in, as if gravity had shifted. Elijah didn't acknowledge the stares. He didn't bow or wave. He walked straight to the center of the room, placed the bag gently on the oak conference table, and unzipped it with the same care a soldier might handle a folded flag. From inside, he pulled a torn, wrinkled fragment, his old veteran ID card, creased, ripped, nearly unreadable. Doyle had torn it in half, but Elijah had kept both pieces, not out of sentiment, out of principle. He placed the torn card on the polished surface and looked directly at the council chairman. His voice, when it came, was as even as steel cooled too long to bend. "I didn't come for a new card," he said. "I came to remind you, some things, once torn, don't reprint. No one interrupted, no one dared. The chairman swallowed, lips parting slightly to respond, then thought better of it. Elijah picked up the pieces of his cardigan, slid them back into the bag, zipped it shut, and stood waiting, not for a reply, but for acknowledgement. It came in silence. Later that week, a 7-figure offer from a publishing house arrived. Exclusive rights to his story, full editorial control, guaranteed bestseller. The letter called him a cultural symbol of justice and resilience. He read it once, folded it twice, threw it in the fireplace, and didn't watch it burn. When a reporter caught up with him outside the DMV of all places and asked, "Sir, do you plan to write your memoir?" Elijah didn't slow his pace. "I don't need a biography," he said, "just a country that stops humiliating the ones who never ask to be remembered." Meanwhile, Hanley, now a decorated officer in his own right, was invited to the Capitol for a televised ceremony. The medal had been approved. There were no more committees, no more vetoes, no more silence. Hanley stood before a crowd of officials, veterans, and citizens, holding the box in his left hand, but the right one remained clenched at his side until the moment came. He looked into the camera and said only this: "Senior Chief Elijah Freeman once told me, I'm not a hero, I just kept a promise. I have the honor of fulfilling one now." He accepted the medal on Elijah's behalf, but he didn't wear it. He carried it, open-palmed, as if even touching it without permission was a sin. At the same time, across a different hallway in the Justice Department, Doyle submitted a resignation letter, handwritten, smudged, but it was denied. A printed memo followed: "Active federal investigation prohibits departure." He was trapped by the very system he'd once used to trap others. His uniform now fit like skin he couldn't shed. Roy sat before the House Oversight Committee, eyes glassy, hands sweating under the table. The questioning was precise, surgical. "Have you previously profiled individuals based on appearance or vehicle condition? Have you ever ignored protocol in favor of physical assertion? What does the phrase, 'types like him,' mean to you in this context?" He stumbled, stammered, caught himself, then sank further. Outside, veteran associations camped at the gates holding signs not with slogans, but names. Names of men like Elijah. Men never granted hearings until they became headlines. Back in his home, Elijah sat by the window again, the same one where the light bent across the cracked picture frame. He had taken the medal out of its box, not to display, but to examine. He held it up to the fading afternoon sun, watching the medal catch the light like something both sacred and unnecessary. He didn't pin it to his chest. He didn't hang it on the wall. He placed it in a drawer beside an old compass, a pocket knife, and a bullet he'd dug out of his thigh in '06. When asked by Hanley later why he hadn't attended the ceremony, Elijah only said, "You don't need to stand in front of people to know you stood for something." He didn't want a stage. He wanted an ending that didn't rewrite his past. And so he lived quietly, but not invisibly. Mail kept coming. More interviews, more offers, but he answered none of them. Because Elijah Freeman understood what the rest of the country was just learning. Honor doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't chase vindication. It waits. And when it rises, it doesn't ask for space. It takes it without apology. It was barely 6 in the morning when Doyle climbed the 3 steps to Elijah Freeman's porch. The sky still wore a layer of gray, like the world hadn't decided yet whether it deserved to be bright. He held a small box in both hands. Inside were 3 items: his police-issued cap, a pair of unused handcuffs, and a folded letter written on lined paper, edges worn from the number of times he'd rewritten it. But the door didn't open. Instead, Hanley stepped out, dressed in plain clothes, but standing like a man who'd been called there by something older than duty. Doyle looked up, eyes rimmed red, voice already small. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to you, I didn't know who he was." Hanley didn't blink. His arms stayed crossed, his jaw locked. The wind moved, but he didn't. "That's exactly why you don't deserve to say sorry," he said flatly. "You don't get to kick a man when he's down and then ask for grace once he stands taller than you ever could. Doyle looked down, the box in his lap, suddenly too heavy for both hands. His knees hit the top step, not performative, just broken. He knelt, not before a man, but before a silence he'd helped build and could never fill. Still, the door stayed shut. Elijah didn't come out. He didn't peek through the blinds. There was nothing in that house for Doyle to touch. Not forgiveness, not present, no permission. A neighbor across the street saw it, filmed it, posted it. No hashtags, no caption, just 4 words carved into the title. The man was not forgiven. Within an hour, it had gone viral, not for drama, but because the footage said something no broadcast ever could. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive, not because the wounded can't give it, but because the wound itself becomes sacred ground. You're no longer welcome. The video showed Doyle kneeling, holding a box no one would take. The porch light flicked off, the camera faded, but the silence stayed. Across town, Roy sat in his apartment, fingers hovering over a keyboard, heart pounding like it used to in training, only this time there was no weapon to reach for, only regret, only hindsight, only one thing left to do. He wrote the email 3 times. The final version was short. Sir, I wanted you to know, you made me reconsider everything, not just that day, every day, before and after. I've resigned. I'm starting over. I don't deserve your reply, but I hope I live like I've heard it. It took Elijah 3 days to respond. His reply was exactly 1 line. If you truly thought again, teach the one who comes after you. I don't have time to educate those who once spat at me. No anger, no punctuation beyond the period. But it hit harder than any indictment, not just to Roy, but to everyone who read it later, because someone, inevitably, would leak it, and no one blamed them for doing it. Meanwhile, Doyle left the box on the porch, quietly, like a thief returning something worthless, too ashamed to steal again. He left the cap turned upside down, the cuffs unlocked. The letter was unread. The porch is still cold from his knees. He walked away without looking back. That afternoon, the same box arrived at his precinct in an evidence envelope. Inside, untouched, unaltered, was everything he had left. The return label, undeliverable, no recipient. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a declaration. Not every apology deserves a witness. The lights in the hearing room weren't forgiving. They didn't flicker, didn't dim, didn't soften the sharp angles of a face forced into exposure. Doyle sat at the center table, not behind a podium, not flanked by allies, alone. Every seat in the chamber was filled. Uniforms, civilians, journalists. But above them all, towering on the digital backdrop behind the committee chair, was the photo. Elijah Freeman, carrying Hanley across the sands of Fallujah, jaw locked, eyes forward. Elijah wasn't there in person. He didn't need to be. He was on every wall, in every breath, in every silence between questions. The room was under federal broadcast. Viewers watching at home surpassed 6 million by the hour mark. But inside, it was the quiet that held weight, not tension, shame. A senior senator leaned forward, eyes locked on Doyle's lowered gaze. You referred to a man who carried his wounded comrades through enemy fire as, quote, trash. He paused, let the word curdle in the air. Tell me, Officer Doyle, what exactly do you intend to defend here today? Your ignorance or your authority? Doyle opened his folder, hands shaking slightly, pulled out a neatly typed sheet. I've prepared a statement, he said, his voice cracked, rehearsed but hollow. I apologize, the senator cut in, sharp as a blade. Apologize for what? That you got caught? Or that you were wrong? The silence after the question was almost cruel, not because Doyle had no answer, but because he had too many, and none that could matter now. He tried to continue reading. The words blurred. The ink felt heavier than his badge ever had. Behind him, at the back of the room, a figure stood. Not press, not a politician. A man in civilian clothes, sleeves rolled, tan line on his wrist where a watch used to sit. He cleared his throat, voice steady and cold. I served with Elijah in Mosul, he said. Watched him take a hit meant for me. I've worn this badge since I came home. But if this man, he pointed to Doyle, still gets to wear the same title, then I refuse to let mine mean the same thing. He reached into his coat, pulled out his law enforcement ID and walked straight to the committee table. He placed the badge down, gently, like one might place a folded flag over a coffin. "If this is what we've become," he said, "I'd rather serve no one." The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. There was no applause, no protest, just breathless witnessing. One of the committee members turned a page, not to continue, but to break the moment. "Officer Roy declined to appear today," she said, "but submitted a statement under oath." She tapped her pen. His words, "We acted without integrity. I cannot excuse it. I only hope my silence now is not mistaken for approval then." Another beat of silence passed, long enough for everyone to feel the weight of absence. Doyle tried again. I was just doing what," he faltered. The excuses collapsed mid-sentence. There were no instructions that could excuse disdain. No manual justified cruelty, and no policy ever wrote his smirk on Elijah's torn card. The hearing ended without drama. No gavel slam, no media frenzy, just a clerk's voice. "This session is concluded." No one clapped. No one stood. People just left, quiet, measured, like exiting a church after a funeral you didn't deserve to attend. Doyle remained seated for a while after everyone else had gone. The camera is still recording. His hands were still folded over his script, but now even he seemed to realize the one man who should have heard the apology was the only man too dignified to need it. There was no motorcade, no escort, no speech to welcome him back. Elijah Freeman walked onto the base like a shadow returning home, not to be seen, but to see. His boots pressed into the old gravel paths of the training yard, worn smoother now, but still stubborn in their silence. In one hand he carried his weathered navy cap, not worn, but held, as if it were no longer just clothing, but testimony. No announcements had been made, no email circulated, but somehow the base knew. The air grew still. The laughter from the barracks faded. Even the clatter of trays in the mess hall turned uncertain, as if respect had walked in and everything else forgot its place. Then came a voice, young, uncertain, respectful. A recruit stepped out of formation. He wasn't told to move, he just did. "Sir," the boy said, posture stiff, voice a whisper over the wind, "are you the legend they talk about?" Elijah looked at him, not up or down, just level. "Legends don't come back," he said. "I'm just here to see what's still standing." And then he walked past him. He didn't need an introduction. Every boot that heard his voice had already heard his story. They didn't need to see his medals. They had memorized the footage. His silence was louder than doctrine. His steps are realer than any parade. In the mess hall, a new sign hung where the old unit flag used to be. Bold black letters on steel gray background. "No one wears the uniform until they understand what it means." No one questioned when it went up. They knew who inspired it. In the central lecture hall, once used for orientation videos and forgotten ethics talks, a new program had been installed. The Elijah Freeman Instruction Series, mandatory for all recruits, reviewed annually by command. Not a film, not a story, just recordings of real testimony, real actions, real consequences. It was harder than fiction, because it was impossible to look away. The base's physical training wing had been renamed with no ceremony, just a plaque, Senior Chief Freeman Room. It didn't sparkle. It didn't beg for attention, but every trainee who passed through noticed their posture straighten. The name didn't demand obedience, it demanded worth. Hanley was waiting outside that room when Elijah finished his quiet walkthrough. He held out his cap, the same one Elijah had once returned to him. This time he asked for something in return. "Would you sign it?" Hanley asked. "Just for me to remember." Elijah looked at the cap for a long time, then shook his head, gently but firmly. "Don't keep my name," he said. "Keep the way I stood still that day." And that was all. Hanley nodded, lowered the cap, but said nothing else. There was nothing else that needed saying. Before Elijah left, one more soldier, maybe 19, maybe younger, approached him. This one didn't call him sir, didn't ask for a photo, just looked like he'd been holding in a question since the first whisper of the legend walked through the gates. "How do you know the young man asked. "When it's time to stand up." Elijah didn't flinch. "When others no longer dared to kneel," he said. Then he turned and left the base behind again. He didn't need to stay, because now, finally, something was standing with him. He left the base behind with no farewell. No formation turned to salute. They didn't have to. The silence he carried now echoed louder than any fanfare. Elijah Freeman walked out of that compound as quietly as he had entered it. But something remained behind, less like a shadow and more like a compass. Days later, his name appeared again, not in a news cycle, not on a list of medals, but embedded in a nationwide petition demanding ethical reform across the law enforcement system. He hadn't authored it, hadn't signed it, but above the signature line, his image stood. Not a photo of triumph, not a portrait of war, just a frame from the day the world watched him stand still while others mocked, while a room full of soldiers behind him stood to attention, not for power, but for principle. The clip played without narration, no voiceover guided the moment. The silence told its own story. He was being humiliated. He did not speak. But when they looked into his eyes, they stopped laughing. That was the frame. That was enough. The effect rippled faster than policy ever had. Over 400 police academies quietly introduced a new case study into their systemic ethics syllabus. It had no title other than a question: what happens when a uniform forgets what it means? The answers weren't taught, they were discovered. Cadets sat in silence as the footage played, again and again. Every year, every class. Some cried, some clenched their jaws, none looked away. A training document leaked from one of the nation's largest metropolitan departments. Revisions were marked in red ink. One phrase had been boxed, highlighted, and underlined 3 times. The humiliated man did not raise his voice. Yet he won. Below it, a new heading was added to their internal code: the free man model. There was no ceremony when it was adopted, but those who read it felt something shift. A major television network released a documentary 2 weeks later. It was called The Man Who Didn't Kneel. It did not feature interviews. It did not dramatize events. It simply walked viewers through the before and after. The day Elijah Freeman was stopped, the words used against him, the silence he responded with, the salutes that followed, and the system that had to explain itself after. It wasn't entertainment, it was a reckoning. Elijah didn't appear in the film. He wasn't asked to. His presence was no longer required. He had become the proof and the mirror. Doyle, once so loud, was now legally silenced. His license to practice law enforcement was revoked without expiration. No county in the country would accept his clearance. A permanent red flag marked his name, visible to every department, recruiter, and public board. No statement was made by the ethics board. They didn't need to. The data spoke. The flag stayed. From the media, entirely. No farewell posts, no podcast redemption arcs, just silence. Some said he moved to a cabin in the north. Others claimed he started volunteering anonymously. No one confirmed anything. What was known, though, was this: he never responded to another press request again. Back in Elijah's town, no reporters waited at his door anymore. They'd tried. He hadn't answered. A child once left a folded flag drawing in his mailbox. Elijah pinned it to the fridge and said nothing about it. Some men hang medals. He hung in silence. He wasn't on social media. He didn't attend award galas. He never cashed a check from any interview request. When a university offered to name an ethics center after him, he declined, then mailed back a sticky note that read, "Name it after the person who changes, not the person who stood still." And yet every time an officer stood between cruelty and conscience, his name was whispered. Every time a recruit hesitated before shouting, before judging, before asserting control where none was needed, they remembered a man who had nothing left to prove, but still stood like everything depended on it. He wasn't the face of a campaign. He was the pause before the trigger, the silence before the verdict, the breath before someone asked, what would dignity do right now? In classrooms, his clip was no longer played for drama. It was played for calibration. If you could watch it and still justify abuse, you weren't ready. If you flinched, maybe you were close. In one precinct, a single quote was engraved into the entrance wall. He didn't kneel, and yet we all stood. No one signed it. No one needed to, because the name Elijah Freeman was no longer just a name. It had become the question people asked when facing the line between command and conscience, and the answer they gave when choosing to cross it with honor. He had never asked to become a symbol. That's why he did. The clip played on a projector screen in a classroom in Northern Virginia. No sound, just motion. Elijah was standing by his battered motorcycle. The officers are closing in, the sneers, the silence, and then those soldiers arriving, the salute, the stillness. The class didn't blink. They didn't whisper. No one laughed. The air felt held in someone's palm, suspended above a question waiting to fall. When the screen faded to black, the teacher didn't explain. She stood at the front with her hands loosely clasped, eyes scanning her students as they searched each other's faces for a clue on what to say. Then one student stood, his voice not loud but steady. "Ma'am," he asked, "if it were us, who would stand up first?" The teacher didn't move. She didn't shift her expression. She only said, "That's a question each of you has to carry alone." And that's how it started. Not with speeches, not with orders, but with a pause. With weight, with the knowledge that somewhere a man had been torn down without raising his voice, and in doing so, had lifted something back into place for the rest of them. 2 days later, a limited run of replica Navy caps hit the internet. Gray, slightly weathered, with only one bold word stitched in white, Freeman. Beneath it, barely visible unless you looked close, "Stand still, not silent." They sold out in 48 hours, not as merchandise, but as reminders. To wear one wasn't fashionable. It was a challenge. In New York, a communications professor rewrote her curriculum overnight. Under the new unit, Passive Defiance in Public Narrative, she featured Elijah's case first, not as a historical moment, but as a living construct. Students watched the footage, analyzed frame-by-frame silence, paused on facial expressions, studied crowd reactions. The moment he didn't move, the professor said, the power shifted forever. In Kansas, a woman posted a short clip. No face, just her voice. "I was once stopped by police," she said, "humiliated for the way I looked, the way I spoke. I wanted to scream. I didn't. I don't know if I did the right thing, but after seeing him, I realized maybe standing still is a kind of reply, a kind they can't erase." The clip reached 2 million views in less than 3 days. On college campuses, student-led groups began organizing monthly vigils, not of mourning, but of reflection. Every January, across more than 50 universities, students gathered silently in open quads. No microphones, no chants, just a single screen looping Elijah's stillness and the moment soldiers stood behind him. They called it January Resolve. There were no invites, only attendance. In Chicago, a boy no older than 10 wrote a letter in looping cursive. "Dear Mr. Elijah," it said, "I never met you. I don't think I will. But when I saw the video of you not talking when they tried to be mean, I told my friends I want to be like you. They said, why? I said, because he didn't act like they did. And still they listened to him in the end." The letter arrived at a veterans center. Staff didn't know what to do with it at first, but someone placed it on a cork board near the entrance. Within days, people began pinning notes beside it. Not long essays, just lines. "Me too. He helped me see it. Silence isn't surrender." Freeman wasn't loud, but I heard him. The name wasn't being honored anymore. It was being used as a question, as a filter, as a bar to measure character when the rules ran out. In a nation fractured by noise, opinion, and aggression, there was one moment, one man, who had spoken louder by saying nothing. That absence of force had become a force in itself. And in doing so, Elijah Freeman became something rarer than a hero. He became a standard. Not everyone agreed, not everyone cared, but everyone, when confronted with that footage, felt something they couldn't explain. It was uncomfortable, it was clarifying, and it didn't ask for allegiance. It asked for awareness. It reminded people what to recognize in themselves when tested, and, more importantly, what others deserved, even when the world said they didn't. He never returned to the spotlight, never stepped onto a stage, never replied to the flood of letters. He didn't need to. By not chasing the echo of his name, he allowed others to speak it with more meaning. And that's what pulled a generation upright again. Not punishment, not lectures, but one man's refusal to kneel until everyone behind him remembered how to stand. The request came quietly, through official channels, a final interview, one last sit-down, just to capture the voice of the man who had stirred the country by refusing to speak when it was easiest to scream. The request was respectful, carefully worded, backed by a national network, and promised dignity. Elijah declined. No cameras, no lights, no stage. Instead, he sent a package no larger than a meal tray. Inside, a notebook. Leather cracked, pages yellowed, the corners softened by years in a chest drawer no one had ever opened except him. Taped inside the front cover was a single sheet of paper, the ink faint but precise, his handwriting, one sentence. I don't need to speak. They've spoken for me, and I kept my word. I never left my brothers behind. That night, on national television, a host read those words aloud, voice low, as if narrating a prayer rather than a quote. The camera didn't cut to applause. There wasn't any, just the slow rise of an image, the folded flag, triangle-shaped, cradled in white gloves, held against a dark background. A country is watching, listening, remembering. Somewhere in a base in the Midwest, a young woman in uniform stood beside her locker, tears held but not shed. She turned to her squad mate and whispered, "I almost quit. I almost walked out. Until I saw that man not say a word, and it hit me, his silence covered more than my doubts ever could." That moment never made it to broadcast, but someone filmed it anyway. It got shared and watched again. In the weeks that followed, an old audio file surfaced, grainy, from 1992, a lecture Elijah had once given during an internal ethics training session for rising officers. He hadn't known it was recorded. No one had. The file had been buried deep in archives labeled internal morale programming. The voice on the tape was unmistakable, calm, firm, unhurried. "I don't have lessons," he said. "I don't have secrets to leadership. I have one thing I offer. Live in a way that needs no apology. And if you ever find yourself surrounded by silence, it better be the kind that makes others straighten their backs, not lower their eyes." The file went viral, not in a firestorm, but like water rising slowly, irresistibly. Then came the leak, a single document, obtained from an old Pentagon archive, heavily redacted but damning in what it didn't conceal. A field report summary from Iraq, stamped "Top Confidential," dated 15 years ago. In the margin, a typed note, "Recommended non-disclosure of event. The subject performed actions beyond the scope of reportable valor. Consider indefinite silence for national narrative continuity." People didn't need it explained, they understood. He hadn't just been erased from glory, he had been buried under bureaucracy because his story didn't fit the script. And yet, here he was, still silent, still more powerful than anyone given a stage. Outside, the U.S. media outlets from Europe to Asia began running specials. One banner headline from a British paper read simply, "The Old Soldier Who Made America Look in the Mirror." French broadcasters dubbed him Le Témoin Silencieux, the silent witness. But Elijah didn't respond, didn't collect honors, didn't pose. At home, his porch light stayed dim, his garden still tidy, the flag above his door remained perfectly folded, untouched by wind, and his mailbox overflowed, not with praise, but with letters that started not with "Dear Hero," but with "Thank you for not giving up on us." No answer ever came back, because he knew none was needed. He had already said enough by saying nothing at all. The report was 87 pages long, stamped with the seal of the federal government and distributed in plain envelopes to every law enforcement agency in the country. But the page that mattered most came near the end. It was just 3 words: the Freeman Effect. No preamble, no embellishment, just a name that once meant nothing to policymakers and now meant everything to those rebuilding what they had broken. The chapter outlined new national standards. From now on, no badge would be issued without a mandatory course in ethical restraint. No officer would carry a weapon without first learning the story of the man who didn't raise his voice, didn't fight back, and still won. Elijah Freeman's name didn't appear on the front page of the New York Times. It wasn't shouted by pundits, but it was printed, quietly, precisely, on the inside covers of thousands of training manuals now being distributed across academies, precincts, and legislative offices. His name, once erased from a monument in Fallujah, now anchors a blueprint for national reform. In Oregon, the Department of Justice cited the Freeman case while announcing their overhaul of disciplinary review boards. In Ohio, a bipartisan task force introduced the Standing Act, mandating that any officer found guilty of public humiliation would be permanently barred from supervisory roles. Elijah's name wasn't in the law, but everyone knew who it was written for. The reforms came in waves, a rippling effect. One precinct altered policy, then a whole city. One city testified to Congress, then entire states began to shift. The man who had said almost nothing had redefined everything. At the National Academy of Law Enforcement in Quantico, a new course was unveiled. Limits of Power, the Freeman Case Study. Unlike most seminars, it began not with a lecture, but with a video. No narration, no captions, just a loop of Elijah being harassed, staying still, and then, slowly, an entire military unit forming a wall behind him. The screen faded to black. Then one line appeared. "This is the cost of forgetting who we serve." Peru's go-to, cadets were told that passing this module was not optional. Some rolled their eyes. Others cried. But none left unchanged. In a sculpture garden outside Fort Leavenworth, a new statue was raised, paid not by the government but by a coalition of veteran artists. It showed no face, no gesture of victory, just a man standing still, his spine straight, one hand resting on the seat of a broken motorcycle, the other tucked behind his back like he was remembering the weight of a fallen brother. A plaque read, "To the one who stood still, so we could move forward." Elijah didn't attend the unveiling. He wasn't in the news anymore. He wasn't in any press rooms. The cameras had turned elsewhere, looking for something louder, something flashier. But in homes across the country, candles began appearing on windowsills every November 4th, the anniversary of the day he'd been humiliated. People didn't say it aloud, but the act had become sacred, quiet, personal, a reminder that justice didn't come from exposure, but from reflection. In Denver, an anonymous donor covered tuition for 20 students at a community college under one condition. The recipients had to write an essay on what standing still meant to them. One student wrote, "It means not punching back. It means not retreating. It means standing there until the whole world realizes it's the one that moved too far." The essay was never published, but the professor framed it anyway. No monuments, no medals, just echoes, in the streets, in classrooms, and the slight pause before a young officer asks themselves, what would Freeman do if it were him? The answer never needed to be spoken. It had already changed everything. By the second winter after the incident, the name Elijah Freeman had become a silent litmus test in rooms of authority, not for debate. No one dared reduce him to a talking point, but for presence, for weight. In internal memos of police boards, in closed-door judiciary briefings, there was now a recurring phrase, "Does this hold up?" under Freeman. It wasn't a question of legality, it was a question of decency. Would this action, this policy, this behavior survive being placed next to the image of a man who stood still under insult and made the world around him adjust? In Arkansas, a district commander was asked about a proposed rearmament policy. He simply paused, then said, "Not with Freeman on the wall." The room went quiet. The proposal was dropped without a vote. Across the Midwest, ethics instructors began adapting Elijah's image as a case study, not for his resilience, but for his refusal to flinch, refusal to curse, refusal to accept the false apology. Students wrote reflections, grappling with the idea that silence could dismantle injustice more brutally than noise. In a Louisiana class, one cadet asked, "Isn't that weakness?" The professor simply played the clip again. The same 90 seconds. The sneer, the baton, the eyes, then the pivot, the Humvee, the salute, the stillness. No one asked a second question. Meanwhile, state legislatures began adjusting disciplinary protocol, not out of fear of public backlash, but out of moral unease. The phrase, duty of restraint, entered new policy drafts. Officers were no longer trained merely to de-escalate violence. They were now evaluated on whether they could contain the impulse to dehumanize. And behind each of these policy shifts was the silhouette of a man with tired shoulders and a hat stitched with a single faded letter, N. The Freeman training module was updated into a full-day immersion in moral thresholds. The first hour showed the abuse. The second hour showed the silence. The third hour, the most difficult, was dedicated to self-confrontation. Cadets had to write down the last time they spoke to someone who didn't fight back, the last time they used their title as a weapon, the last time they confused silence with permission. Not all could finish. Back in Washington, the Department of Homeland Security received thousands of petitions requesting the inclusion of the Freeman Doctrine in national recruitment standards. An internal report circulated quietly. It acknowledged the impact but warned, adopting symbolic standards risks politicization. A junior staffer scribbled in the margin, "So does doing nothing." On the streets, Elijah's presence lingered in symbols, not slogans. Stickers appeared on coffee shop doors, still standing, verified. No one sold them. They just spread. In schools, a new poster campaign launched with a simple design, the shadow of a man with his arms by his side, surrounded by rising lines like a shockwave frozen in time. At the bottom, he didn't raise a hand, he raised the standard. The government commissioned an academic task force to analyze the incident's long-term effects on civil perception of authority. The final paragraph of their findings read, "Freeman's case is the first documented instance where a non-verbal act redefined procedural training across federal and local agencies without a single lawsuit filed. It became known as the silent shift. Not everyone accepted it. Some commentators on fringe channels dismissed the reforms as sentimental overreach. Since when does a man with a grimace get to rewrite our codes?" one host asked. But their audience dwindled. Ratings dipped. Public trust leaned elsewhere now, toward the weight of quiet conviction. And still, Elijah Freeman said nothing. He had not appeared in interviews, had not commented on the laws bearing his ghost. He hadn't accepted awards nor responded to invitations. His mailbox was full, his phone disconnected. One letter from a retired general simply read, "You did what whole governments couldn't. You made us look in the mirror." No reply came, only silence. And in that silence, institutions trembled, not out of fear, but out of recognition that somewhere a man who refused to be bowed had become the measure of whether they still deserved to stand. In a modest town square in Ohio, a bronze sculpture appeared one morning with no grand unveiling, no press release. It stood just under 6 feet tall, not exaggerated, not stylized, just a man in boots, hands loose at his sides, one foot slightly turned as if ready to pivot or stay still depending on what stood in front of him. His cap wasn't on his head, it rested in his hand. The plaque beneath didn't say hero, legend, or soldier, just 4 words. He stayed, we moved. It was the students who raised the money. Not veterans, not politicians, not corporations, but students from law schools, journalism programs, and community colleges. They raised funds quietly, with donations capped at $20 per person. One of them explained, "This isn't about tribute, it's about setting the bar where it belongs." At the Capitol, a draft bill titled the Freeman Ethical Standard began began circulating between committees. It didn't promise change. It demanded proof of understanding. Embedded in it was a mandate. No officer could be promoted unless they passed a written and oral exam about the Elijah Freeman incident, what happened, what didn't happen, and why the silence spoke louder than any defense ever could. Meanwhile, an independent think tank published a white paper titled The Freeman Effect: Posture as Protest. It detailed how a single posture, upright, silent, uncompromising, had led to revisions in over 14 state-level training manuals. The paper concluded, "There will be louder voices, but there may never again be a louder silence." The Department of Defense commissioned a quiet internal audit, unpublicized, unbranded. Its purpose? To identify all previously overlooked acts of individual integrity, buried in disciplinary files, overlooked evaluations, or unsigned recommendations. At the top of the file, handwritten in black ink, "Start with Fallujah." In parks across the country, spontaneous candlelight gatherings marked November 4th, not with speeches, not with rallies, but with silence. People stood in small groups, facing the wind, hands by their sides. Some wore caps. Some held nothing. All carried something intangible, but heavy. Children asked, "Who was he?" And parents, teachers, and grandparents answered, not with legends but with facts. He didn't hit back, and somehow he still won. Even digital spaces have transformed. A popular design app included a new template called Freeman Frame, a faded border with a centered space encouraging people to insert a moment where they didn't react, didn't fight back, but held. The tagline, "Define it by stillness." In training halls of authority, this stillness became a requirement, not as absence of action, but as the presence of restraint. Recruits were taught, power that has to announce itself is just noise, but power that absorbs insult and does not bend, that changes rooms. Roy, now living under a pseudonym in a remote county, no longer appeared in public. He reportedly refused all media. A neighbor once said, "He walks with a limp, not from injury, but like something inside fell wrong and never healed." Doyle, after a string of failed applications to private security firms, was last seen working night inventory at a storage warehouse. His record remained flagged. At one point, he petitioned for record expungement. It was denied with a single line, "Pattern, not incident." But this story was no longer theirs. It wasn't about Roy's silence or Doyle's ruin. It was about a country that had forgotten the weight of standing without spectacle and was now learning again through the shadow of a man who never sought to teach. One network broadcast a retrospective titled Freeman, the Absence That Corrected Us. It aired once. No reruns. No streaming rights. Just a single transmission. At the end of the segment, the anchor didn't say thank you, didn't say good night. He simply stood, nodded once, and the screen faded to black. That single minute generated more calls than any political speech in the last decade. And still, Elijah remained unreachable. No press contact, no agent, no speaking tour. His last known address returned all mail marked "Moved, do not forward." But his name, Freeman, had moved. It had moved into textbooks, memorials, HR policies, protest chants, scholarship essays, sermons, and courtroom summations. It had moved from a man into a measuring stick, from a person into a principle. The final ripple didn't make headlines. It arrived as a whisper in boardrooms, a nudge in training rooms, a breath held longer in courtrooms. A memo circulated within the Justice Department began with no preamble. Ensure they all know what silence means. The only attachment, a photograph. Elijah standing, surrounded by soldiers frozen in salute. No captions, none needed. Across several states, governors quietly amended internal law enforcement standards, citing case-driven historical reference without ever naming it, but the reference was understood. Internal reviews shifted tone. Less emphasis on protocol, more on posture. Not body language, but moral position. Reports no longer asked, was it legal, but was it right? At a high school debate tournament in Oregon, the final round resolved around the motion, silent resistance is the strongest form of leadership. One team opened their argument by playing the clip of Elijah, silent, insulted, and immovable. before saying a single word. The room didn't erupt. It hushed. The judges scored unanimously. In a prison library in Nevada, a group of inmates requested access to articles and recordings of Elijah Freeman. When asked why, one of them said he wasn't perfect, but he didn't flinch, and maybe that's the only thing worth learning this late. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived at a small community center in Fallujah, addressed in shaky block handwriting, no sender. Inside, a single photo. Elijah and Hanley, back in 2004, covered in dust, leaning on each other with everything but words, written beneath in Arabic. There are still Americans who remember what they owe. That picture found its way to a mural in a rebuilt school, then to a national publication in Iraq, then to a UN humanitarian award citing transnational echoes of moral consistency. But no one could find the man who sent it, and no one tried, because it was never about finding him again. It was about never losing what he showed. In the National Archives, a clerk filed a document under civic integrity. It bore no government seal, only a stamped header, Freeman Principle. It read like code, not prose. When challenged unjustly, respond with stillness. When insulted, absorb it with eyes open. When your dignity is questioned, let your silence write the answer. When no one remembers who stood before, make them remember how. Outside, on the steps of the Capitol, a girl not yet 10 years old stood in front of the statue of an unnamed soldier, holding a hand-drawn sign, "I want to be like the quiet man." Her mother, a veteran, knelt beside her. "You already are," she said. "You're standing." No flashbulbs clicked, no anthems played, no voiceover wrapped the scene in narrative. But somewhere far from there, in a house no one could find on a map, an old man sat at a table. His cap lay beside him, the same one as always, threadbare and plain. He stared out a window, not expecting visitors. No medals lined his wall. No newspapers sat on the desk, just a stack of envelopes unopened. Not because he was rude, but because he already knew what they'd say. He hadn't asked to be honored. He hadn't tried to be remembered. He had only refused to be erased. And that, in the end, had been enough to change everything. The house was small, not poor, just silent. Its wooden panels had no nameplate, no decoration, no sign that anyone of consequence resided behind the door. And yet, when the mailman stepped onto the gravel path that morning, he moved as if approaching a monument. His fingers held a single envelope, white, weightless, sealed with a faint blue mark from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He looked up at the porch, where a man stood as if carved from memory. Elijah Freeman didn't wear his uniform, didn't lift his hand in salute. He only stood there, hat in hand, spine straight, eyes watching the horizon, as if waiting for something more permanent than the mail. The mailman hesitated. "Are you him?" His voice cracked, not with doubt, but with the kind of awe people reserve for names that have turned into stories. Elijah didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't soften. He simply replied, "I used to be. Now, I'm just standing here waiting for the next one to stand straight." The mailman bowed slightly, not in protocol but in respect, and turned without another word. The envelope rested gently on the threshold, untouched. Just as the mailman disappeared down the road, a blur of red shot past, the rusted frame of a child's bicycle screeching to a halt. A girl, no older than 10, swung her leg off and stared wide-eyed at Elijah. Her breath caught in her chest, like she'd stumbled into a dream someone once described but never believed. "You're the man who didn't speak, right?" she asked, her voice trembling not with fear but reverence. Elijah's reply was a simple nod. No flourish, no weighty sermon, just a yes too deep for word. Without hesitation, the girl stood tall, brought her right hand to her temple, and delivered a salute so sincere it made time pause. The kind of salute born not from training but instinct. Elijah returned nothing. Not because he didn't notice, but because he didn't need to. The message had already been sent. She got back on her bike, pedaled away, and didn't look back. But something about the way her posture had changed. It told him everything. Rain began without warning, the kind of rain that didn't rush but arrived with solemnity, as if nature itself knew how to whisper respect. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. He let the drops soak into his shirt, slide down the bridge of his nose and drip from his fingers. A man who had once stood unmoved under mortars and incoming fire wasn't about to seek shelter from the weather. The rain was nothing. What mattered was stillness, and from that stillness, something was watching. A Humvee crept down the road, not roaring, but idling low, slow, reverent. Its matte exterior bore no rank insignia, no flags, no markings of pride, only mud stains from use. Inside, behind the windshield fogged by time and climate, Hanley sat in full silence. He didn't raise a hand, didn't wave, he just looked. And Elijah looked back, eyes locked across 30 yards of memory. No conversation, no gesture, just mutual understanding, etched into both of them like scars that no longer hurt but never faded. The Humvee rolled on. Hanley didn't look back. He didn't need to. Elijah remained, not planted like a statue, but grounded like a storm anchor. Nearby, etched into the metal of an old survey marker beside the gravel road, someone had carved, "Some men need not speak, because their silence becomes the reason we listen." It hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't official, but it said more than any speech could have. It wasn't vandalism. It was scripture, written by a generation searching for something to believe in. Inside the house, no lights flickered on, no television buzzed, no phone rang. On the mantel sat no awards, no medals were displayed, no flags folded in glass boxes. Just one photo remained visible. Elijah in Fallujah, ash-covered, eyes full of life and death in equal measure, carrying a bleeding Hanley on his back. That photo was not framed. It leaned quietly against the wall behind a half-burned candle. The wax had long cooled. The wick had long hardened, but the image still burned. Outside, the rain deepened, but Elijah didn't step back. He stayed at the edge of the porch, where the wood creaked under the weight of permanence. If there was wind, it bowed to him. If there were gods, they watched in silence. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't seek forgiveness. He didn't offer judgment. He only did what he had always done, stood in the place where honor was supposed to be, and waited to see who else might remember how to find it. The storm didn't grow louder, but everything around Elijah felt like it had quieted just for him. Raindrops tapped the porch roof with the soft rhythm of a distant drumline, yet the moment didn't belong to weather. It belonged to the present. The silence he carried wasn't an absence of words. It was weight. It pressed against the ribs of anyone who approached, reminding them that here stood a man who had survived more than just battles, a man who had endured the far crueler war of being forgotten. From across the street, behind a curtain that barely stirred, a neighbor watched, not out of gossip or curiosity, but something closer to reverence. They had seen him every morning, same time, same step. He never waved. He never missed a day, until the day after the broadcast, after the hearings, after the photo of him, bloodied in desert dust, had appeared in government buildings across 50 states. That morning, he hadn't walked. He'd simply stood. And from that day on, people began to slow down near his house. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just passed by a little slower, like approaching sacred ground. Inside a courthouse hundreds of miles away, a judge reviewed a new protocol titled the Freeman Clause. It stated that before any officer received their final badge, they must complete a silent assessment. No speaking, no defense, just an hour of footage, the humiliation, the push, the stillness, the salute. And then they had to write by hand what they believed justice meant when no one was watching. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about dignity, about whether they recognized it, if they could feel it tremble inside their own hands when faced with power. Back on the road, a young man walked up the hill toward Elijah's house. He wore a hoodie, soaked through, his shoes filled with water, but his steps were determined. When he reached the edge of the porch, he didn't speak. He simply sat on the lowest step, rain dripping from his chin, elbows on knees. After a long while, he finally said, "My brother, he quit the force last week. Said he couldn't wear the badge without seeing you every time he put it on. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. The young man nodded, as if the silence were answer enough. That evening, a woman in her 60s placed a single candle in her kitchen window. Across town, another did the same, then another, and another, until rooftops flickered quietly with amber light. No hashtags, no campaigns, just a remembrance. The date was November 4th. No one had declared it a holiday, but they remembered. And in remembering, they resisted everything that had tried to make them forget, because honor, once revealed, couldn't be buried again, not under bureaucracy, not under shame. An old newspaper editor wrote one final column before retirement. No headline, just a photo of Elijah standing under the rain, with the caption, "This is the shape silence takes when it stands for something." The article itself was blank, just white space. Tens of thousands shared it not for what it said, but for what it dared not say. In that silence, entire generations found a mirror, and in that reflection, they saw what justice had failed to be, what dignity had survived despite being stripped. Elijah finally turned away from the porch that night, not because he was finished, but because he had stood long enough for others to begin. Inside, the light stayed off. He moved through the shadows with the ease of someone who'd known darker places and walked out still carrying light. He sat by the window, still wet, still silent, and watched the flickering candles paint the street in soft fire. In that moment, he knew what many had not yet said out loud. This wasn't about him anymore. It had never truly been about him. The next morning, the porch was dry, though the sky still carried the color of solemnity. A light mist hovered over the gravel path, and the air smelled faintly of old soil and oak, like something waiting to be remembered. Elijah stood behind the screen door, unmoving. Across the yard, where grass grew in slow, uneven patches, a child placed a pebble on the lowest stair. Not a note, not a flower, just a stone, small, silent, deliberate. It stayed there untouched, not because it was sacred, but because no one dared remove something offered without a word. By midday, more stones appeared. In Washington, a sealed envelope was delivered to the Secretary of Defense. Inside, a photo. Not Elijah in combat, not Elijah in court, just him, standing still on a public street, eyes forward, spine unbent, while men with authority laughed beside him. No caption, no explanation, but the memo attached read, "Use this when words fail." In briefing rooms from Atlanta to Anchorage, that image replaced decades of generic code of conduct posters. Not as an example of victimhood, but of moral gravity. "Look at this man," one commander told a new unit. "Now ask yourself, if that were your father, what would you have done? And if that were you, would you have stood still or turned?" Meanwhile, Doyle's name stopped trending. Not because he was forgiven, but because silence had taken back the narrative. No angry tweets, no demands, just disappearance. The system didn't need to destroy him. He had already done that himself. His badge remained revoked, his appeals were ignored, his presence was erased from the very institutions that once legitimized him. Roy, on the other hand, lived with the weight differently. He didn't vanish, he didn't run. He worked odd jobs under aliases, always watching over his shoulder, always catching glimpses of headlines that reminded him of the silence he once mocked. And each time, he remembered the feel of Elijah's eyes on him. Not burning, not accusing, just steady, like judgment that didn't have to speak because it had already won. In a Midwestern university, a professor asked his students to define authority. Most wrote about laws, structure, and rank. One student held up a printout of Elijah's still frame, paused from the documentary. "This," she said, "is the only authority I want to answer to, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to make you check your spine." No one disagreed. Later that week, Hanley received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. Inside were just 5 words. "I stood because you did." There was no signature, but Hanley didn't need one. He folded the paper carefully and placed it between the pages of his father's war journal. Some stories didn't need recording, they needed to pass on. At a small coffee shop near Fort Benning, a group of young recruits sat huddled around a tablet. They weren't watching a war film. They weren't debating protocol. They were simply replaying, frame by frame, the moment Elijah's hat was returned to his head by Hanley's head. One of them whispered, "That's not a salute, that's absolution." Another added, "No, it's inheritance." Outside that same shop, someone had spray painted onto the sidewalk, "Not all leaders need a podium." It wasn't signed, but everyone who walked past slowed down. And somewhere in the backwoods of Georgia, far from press and parades, Elijah lifted the lid of an old wooden box in his shed. Inside were medals, letters, photographs, and one torn veteran card, neatly taped back together, though never fully straight. He didn't take anything out. He just looked for a while, then closed the lid and left it there, because not everything needs to be displayed. Some honors lived best in the dark, as quiet anchors to lives that never asked for acknowledgement, only the space to remain upright. The last light of day spilled onto the porch as Elijah stepped out, the boards creaking beneath his boots, the air crisp with the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. His figure was framed by dusk, not dramatic, just there, solid, undeniable. Across the street, a teenage boy paused mid-stride, his skateboard kicking up a soft screech as it rolled to a stop. He looked at Elijah, unsure of what to say. Then he simply nodded. Not the nod of a fan or even of someone who understood everything, just the nod of a kid who recognized a line that should never be crossed, and the man who stood before it so others didn't have to. Elijah nodded back. No more words. Down the road, the corner store that used to sell cheap beer and bad coffee had changed owners. A sign now hung over its door, Freeman's. Not a franchise, not a campaign, just a name that told people who passed through that dignity once stood there and never moved. Inside, a photo was taped beside the register. Elijah, hat back on, standing next to Hanley. Underneath it, a quote, "If you must take sides, choose the one that stays quiet and doesn't flinch." At the local school, the hallway mural that once depicted generic eagles and flags had been painted over. In its place, an image of a man, not young, not grandiose, just still, facing forward. Above him, character begins where applause ends. A woman in Kansas wrote in her blog, "I used to believe silence meant defeat. Now I understand. It's the weight that crushes lies when shouted long enough." Her words went viral, not because they were clever, but because truth has a texture everyone recognizes when it's finally said out loud. That year, a new national ethics curriculum for law enforcement was passed, not by sweeping legislation, not by protest, but by memo, quiet memos, ones that referenced a single entry, the Freeman precedent, in understated mandatory footnotes. No loud banners, no credits, just an instruction. Watch the tape, then teach your recruits what real resistance looks like. No one questioned it. Somewhere on the West Coast, a sculptor unveiled a monument, not a towering bronze of Elijah's likeness, not a battlefield scene, just a bench, plain wood, no backrest. On it, an engraving, "Some men don't sit because someone has to stand." People came and left letters beneath it, none addressed, all understood. On the eve of what would have been his 71st birthday, a group of former servicemen and women lit candles in rows that stretched across a quiet park. No music, no slogans, just an old tape playing on loop, a radio interview from decades ago. Elijah's voice, barely aged. "I never wanted to be remembered, just not erased." And finally, back at that small, weathered house, no longer marked by mailbox or number, Elijah stood as the rain began to fall again. It wasn't hard this time, just soft enough to settle into the soil, to remind it of weight, of roots, of all the things worth holding. A little girl on a pink bike slowed near the edge of the road. Her jacket was too big, her helmet was askew, but she stopped, looked up, and recognized something in the figure beneath the soft gray sky. "You're the one who didn't yell," she said. Elijah turned, just a little, not smiling, just listening. She saluted. He returned it, brief, firm, Enough. Then the wind shifted. A Humvee rolled by. Not loud, not showy, just steady. Inside, Hanley didn't wave. He didn't need to. The window was down. Their eyes met. It was more than enough. A confirmation. A vow. Kept. As the engine faded into the distance, Elijah stepped back inside. He hung his cap, not as a symbol, just because that's where it belonged. Outside, carved into the nearest stone marker, a single line waited for no one to notice it, yet stayed for all who would. Some men disappear quietly, not because they failed to speak, but because what they said will never leave.